Hey,
Hello.
hey there. You can hear me?
I gotcha. How you doing, Devansh?
Yeah, I'm doing good. What about you?
Life is good. I'm excited to get
Yeah.
to spend time with you.
Yeah, definitely. We've been interacting on Twitter, but haven't got much face to face yet. Yeah.
Yeah, we connected, I think, first time at Plurality.
Right. Yep. Now I
And
remember.
you were I remember when you were describing what you were doing, I was like, that seems like a very practical thing to say. But
Hmm.
um I could sense that there's also something underneath the practicality, right? There's a whole structure that you're thinking of that sits behind the fact you were talking about how do we fund journalists, and
Hmm.
uh and so of course what you're doing is much bigger than just funding journalists. It also includes funding journalists, but yeah, I figured it's time to connect. How was your travel back from? You were in India, or you're going back to India?
I am in India now, but on Wednesday leaving for Paris.
Nice.
Yep. Are you joining at Eat CC or at Funding the Commons? No.
Nope.
Yeah.
I'd like to, but I am otherwise engaged. I have a wedding to go to. Not my wedding,
Right. Yep. You had
but
mentioned. Yeah. Are you
yeah.
married or no?
No, no.
Yeah.
How about you?
Yeah, I got married last year.
Congrats.
Yeah, it's been a good change.
Yeah, tell me about it.
Yeah. Um,
What's it like?
so it's like a kind of one way of thinking is that it's also kind of like a permanent sleepover, which we used to have as kids, right? So you kind of always have that. And I think it's just a good change, because like when you find yourself kind of being in a pattern and experiencing the same things the same way, it's good to just break that pattern, like yeah, that's what karma is, right? It's not about past life or present life. It's about we keep repeating the patterns in our life, and that causes us to be born multiple times. So kind of if you see a pattern in your life, just break the pattern, and see what happens. So I think like marriage has been very good that way in just kind of forcing me out of my slumber. And it's a
Hmm.
slumber party, both of these. Yeah.
That's the irony of leaving your
Yeah.
slumber in order to enter one. Yeah.
Yeah.
Ah, it's beautiful. Hmm. Um, it's something that I'm trying to get into relationship with, is like I'm really passionate about the work that I'm doing. Feels really important.
Mm.
And I think that it's crowding out my interest in having a relationship, in part because of a feeling of like a risk. You know, having a partner is a lot of work, and I want to be present for it. Um, and also just a sense of you know, like it feels like I would be giving up otherwise
Mm.
time,
Have
energy.
you read? Yeah. Have you read Paul Graham's newest article, which he wrote, How to Do Great Work?
No.
Oh, it's next level. It's really good. I'm gonna send that to you right now.
Oh, please do.
But yeah, the one advice he gave people is that like kind of you have How to Do Great Work, it's called. It just came out like a few days ago. And the one advice he did give is that make time for love if it enters your life.
Hmm.
Everything else he's saying should be put on the back burner when you're trying to do great work. But if love enters, like make time for it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk about our shared ambitions then.
Yeah.
How do you describe what you're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. Uh, so I think like kind of one way I do it is creating a feedback loop. So currently in the social sector, there is no feedback loop that people create impact and then they have to go marketing and like kind of writing proposals and other things. And then they hopefully get money and then they create impact. And then again, they have to go in the marketing circuit. So basically one way I explain it is that we're trying to create that feedback loop where people create impact. They mint it as some form of a product like a certificate. People buy that certificate and they get money to create more impact. So creating the feedback loop. And the other way I explain it is by analogy that if I want to go and buy a t-shirt, I don't give money and then wait for 6 months until I get the t-shirt. I give the money and I get the t-shirt instantly. So kind of how do we replicate this t-shirt market in the social impact space? That's the other way I put it.
Yeah. What brought you to this?
So I was working for 4 5 years in with a media outlet in Chhattisgarh, in that like that's in the Maoist areas of central India. And I kind of like the citizen journalism platform had a database of about 3,000 impact reports where a kind of a villager living in that area said, I didn't have clean water. And then I reported it on the platform, and then the government came and actually gave us clean water after that. So I kind of just like, and that organization is always desperate for funds and like really bad at fundraising, and that's not their fault, right? Because if you don't know English, you basically can't raise funds. And a lot of them are like a rural based organization. So that's when I started thinking that, hey, what if we could create a system where they get funded for every additional impact report they create? And I think kind of from that initial thought experiment, I think then I came across the notion of impact certificates in the EA forums. And then I came across hyper certs at plurality. And it's just been like kind of a journey one after the other after that. Yeah. How about yourself?
Cool. Yeah, so I was living in Ecuador with a family there when I just graduated high school, and had basically an experience of, while these people are doing a lot of really valuable work that's going to be transformative for the region in the long term, but there's just no funding for them right now. And it involved clean water, and of course they were selling their the water filters, and I worked in the water filter factory. It was really fun. We would go get dirt, get clay from the Amazon, get wood chips from the Amazon, and we would turn that into a filter. And it was like this really manual work. And then I would go and sell the filters in the surrounding region. And of course, you can do that, and you can sell this product, but there are so many people who cannot afford the water filters. And in part, they can't afford the water filters because they can't afford the water filters, if that makes sense, right? Like
Right.
they have these illnesses that make them unreliable and low energy workers, which then prevents them from being able to afford the filters in order to get out of these loops. So that was my first introduction to of course, the power of markets and capitalism to make these things, because we were able to make a really big impact because we were running a company, and the company could kind of like grow as more people were buying these things. And B, the necessity of funding for public goods, because there's just this class of people. One instance of where you need public goods is you have a certain class of people that cannot afford to pay for the thing that otherwise makes them better. My friend Don likes to talk about, imagine if we had if there actually is a pill or a treatment that could cure depression, but it requires a ton of money of funding. And imagine that depressed people as a class are, would like to be able to fund this. Well, one of the challenges is that depressed people as a class are less productive economically than not depressed people. And so I can't tell if I just lost you. Did I lose you? Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm still here. My Wi-Fi seems to have gone now. Yep.
Yeah, this is her story of how to she says, like, here's another example of a group that would be able to pay if they got better, right? But before they get better, they have literally less ability to fund the thing that will make them more productive. And of course, productivity shouldn't be the measure, but it's like a good concrete example that even people who are very libertarian could get their heads around.
Right. Yep.
So
I
that's
think my
kind of how I
Wi-Fi
got into it.
conked out. Yeah, my Wi-Fi is conked out. Should we switch to audio?
Yeah, am I cutting in and out?
No. I can hear you clearly. Um, yeah, but my internet is bad, so maybe we should remove the video. Is that fine?
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. But I mean, like, going back to the example you said, I mean, don't like loans or micro loans kind of take care of a sustainable model for such cases?
Yeah, can you do it with loaning, with lending?
I mean, like you
Um,
can give them a loan to buy the water filter, and then once they get better and their life starts improving, then you can kind of recollect that loan in some fashion.
um, yeah. So let's see. The the problem with loans is that you would like to actually do something kind of intermediate of this, which
Hmm.
is you would like to be able to have a entrepreneur who goes out and does a whole bunch of good, a social entrepreneur, like giving out water filters. And
Hmm.
then they can promise to investors that they're going to get paid back if what they do turns out to be beneficial. And so they
Hmm.
can get a loan or an investment from investors. And then they can go and do this thing, which is a public good for free for a bunch of people. And if it turns out that it was actually beneficial, then they get paid back. Um,
Hmm.
and right now, yeah, what you'd have to do is you'd have to set up financing for people, and then also uh, the individuals would have to be convinced that it was worth them making, taking the risk of buying this thing. And end up with lots of issues here because, you can imagine a entrepreneur coming along and instead of promising clean water, they promise a radioactive necklace, which is going to protect you from the worms, right? And
Right.
and
Hmm.
bacteria. And they get a bunch of people to take out a bunch of loans in order to buy this thing from them. And so then they make a whole bunch of money. Their investors make a whole bunch of money, but of course, these people haven't actually gotten better. So you want,
Yeah.
so hopefully that answers.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, that's true. I mean, even in like villages, people usually prefer to take loans for assets like a motorcycle or some sort of like kind of immediately revenue generating assets, like,
Right.
yeah.
That too. Yeah.
I
So
think the biggest market might actually be the kind of state government or the local government. They would probably be the biggest market because they would have savings from reduced hospital visits and kind of other savings in that form. So I feel like they are actually the stakeholder that actually will see some benefit from water filters entering the area, right?
that's right. Yeah. And I think that the appropriate way to think about this is as a para-governmental uh, mechanism set, a tool for governments to use that's kind of on the edge of the government, um, which allows for social entrepreneurship to take place. In other words, like permissionless innovation, um, that then can interface seamlessly with governments as well. So governments could use this mechanism set as well as social entrepreneurs.
Hmm. Yeah. So how far along is this what you're working on now?
So this is probably about 50% of my time. I'm also a software consultant um, in order to pay the bills, but I'd like to turn it into um, a full-time thing. I've put in about 7-8 years of work um,
Wow.
on the mechanism set that sits underneath it all, and I think I'm reaching the place where it's making sense to me. So
Hmm.
uh, I think we're getting pretty close to the point where I'm going to be able to release a white paper that talks people through how the mechanism set works.
Wow, that sounds lovely. I'd be happy to give comments on the white paper once you have a draft. Yeah.
Yeah, I would love that. Um,
I
and
think the biggest question is who pays, right? That's the question I still don't understand. Who will pay for those water filters and why
right.
would they
So
pay?
the what I want to say is that uh, the way the mechanism works still has the people who benefited from the water filters paying for the water filters,
Hmm.
but they pay for it at some point in the future.
Hmm.
And one really intuitive way to think about this is imagine that there's a community that says, hey, if you can help us, we promise that we're the kind of community that will value your contributions once we're better off, right? So in other words, we'll pay you once we're better off if you can help us get better off. And let's imagine that you actually believe them, right? So for some reason they're credible. Well, then that would be the case where you really could go to an investor if they also believed that this was going to happen. You could go to an investor, you could say, hey, this community is going to pay us if we do things that are beneficial. Give us funds so that we can go and do beneficial things. Then you're going to go and do the beneficial things. And then the community is going to themselves retroactively fund you, right, for the benefit that you caused. And that's kind of like, you can think about it as a third kind of economic mechanism. You know, you gave the t-shirt example. So the t-shirt example is they have the good, you have the cash, and you do that immediately. The lending example is they have the good, you don't have the cash. And now here's this example where you don't have the good and you don't have the cash, right?
Yeah, right.
And so that's like, from a really high level, that's how it's being solved. But then the question is, how do you implement a mechanism set that allows for the entrepreneur and the investor to have very high confidence that actually that community will follow through on that promise?
Yeah, I think the two kind of things I've seen, like the two mechanisms that play for that. One is like what kind of micro loans in India, how they work is that they always give the loan to the village and not to any individual. So that kind of adds collective pressure to repay, because if that person can't repay, then the rest of the villagers are on the line and on the hook to repay. So I think kind of that collective responsibility model has worked out well for microloan repayments in India. And the second is also having a guarantor like the government. So if you look at kind of one of the models which was successful in Karnataka, like when women self-help groups start their own business, they take a loan at very low interest rates because the government has guaranteed that if they can't repay the loan, we will repay the loan for them. So kind of that's the other mechanism at play, which has allowed them to do this, yeah, which bypasses these problems.
Does the risk of does the government underwriting these loans increase risk of fraud or something like that?
Yeah, that would be my same question, and I've not gone deep enough into the model to kind of look at it, but it's like a smashing success actually if you look at it. Kodumpushri model, and I'm not delved too deeply into it, but my wife was working at UNICEF and the Ministry of Women and Child Development in Maharashtra. So I could probably ask her about some of these mechanisms they use to prevent moral hazard.
I'd be fascinated to learn about that. The risk that I see with government underwriting, which I think it's a great thing to do, where you can get it, but the risk is that you then need to interact with government mechanisms, and we know that those are, compared to entrepreneurship, they're not nearly as dynamic.
Yep, whenever I hear a startup idea saying that, oh yeah, and the government will pay for it, I just like instantly shut off at that point, So
that's right.
Yep.
Well, and I was a startup that did have, I started a startup out of university that did have governments as clients. And the thing that, I mean, there's a strain of people that view the government as like inept or incompetent or whatever, but governments are actually designed in they're designed the way that they're designed on purpose, right? They're intentionally laborious in their decision making so that there's checks and balances, so that there's not fraud, for example. And so I think that you kind of want governments to have that property, and of course you don't want governments to have regulatory capture, is one of the exceptions, but that you want them to. So everybody that I worked with was highly confident, highly competent, highly passionate about what they were doing, but they could only move as fast as the system allows them to move. And this is part of what killed us, is that we had the USDA, the US forest service, we had state parks, we had local parks, we had the National Forest Service, all as customers who were intent to buy, but they had such long sales cycles that we couldn't survive to the point where they could
Wow.
actually pay us.
Yep, definitely.
So
And I think also there's a difference in culture. Like when we looked at it in India or other developing countries, there's this idea, this Chinese idea of Guanxi, Guanxi. So that's basically like kind of a system of patronage, that like I know someone, that this person's nephew is like kind of, his father is my friend. That's why I'll give him the contract in some way because I trust him. So there's this full networks of like kind of, so at least when I hear about like kind of ideas involving government in developing countries, the main thing I actually look at is the background of the person. Does that person have extensive networks amongst bureaucrats and ministers and politicians? Because all of this works through this system of patronage or guanxi. I don't know if it's the same in kind of in like where you, if it's the same way you are.
no, it's in fact it's the inverse, because that would fit under nepotism. And
Hmm.
in the United States, essentially, not only are there laws, there are really strong social norms against nepotism. So if you happen to have a friend who works in the government, then that can harm your chances of getting the contract. Now, this is only kind of true. Of course, one of the opportunities that we got was through a friend of my dad, right?
Okay.
So there
Yep.
are ways, of course, in which you can kind of get these para relationships to transform into contracts, but yeah,
For sure. Yeah, that's how the world works, I suppose.
I suppose so. So yeah, that's kind of high level how I'm approaching it, and it'd be fun to talk through the mechanism set with you, but I'd also just love to hear more about what you're thinking.
Yeah. Yeah, so I think kind of there are two ideas I'm working on in parallel, one for citizen journalism and one for investigative reporting. So they aren't really two ideas, they're both related to the media, but I think they have different answers to the question of who pays, which is really the toughest question to deal with. Like, I think because if you look at something like NFTs, I mean, they have a fixed supply. They have 10,000 NFTs, and then you just focus on pumping the price by increasing the community that's interested in your project. Whereas with something like Impact, it's kind of produced on a daily basis. So, how do you get this buying pressure to kind of keep absorbing the impact that's created every day? I think
Yeah.
that's at a very high level how the two sectors are different. So I think kind of one idea, which is the much sexier idea, I'll start off with that, is on investigative reporting, where you have supposing we collect about $5 million, we would then give that to investigative reporters to investigate some issue, file a lawsuit based on whatever they've investigated, and then based on the damages that are paid, we repay our initial investors from that.
Aha. Interesting. How does the second
Yeah,
one work?
the second one is on uh, it's for citizen journalism platforms, like the example I gave you of the village saying that they had to drink dirty water from the river. And then once they reported this, we worked with the government and we got a hand pump built in their village. And then they reported a story saying, hey, thanks for all your effort and help. We now have clean water through a hand pump and we don't have to drink dirty water anymore. So
Mm.
we kind of take those impact reports, as we call them, and anyone can buy those impact reports and inscribe a message underneath those, like a message of gratitude, like, okay, I'm leaving my job. So I really want to thank all my colleagues for kind of all the support they've given me and the kind of help and the mentorship they provided. And then they can send that message, they can send that gratitude in that the gratitude inscribed in that hypercert, they can send it to their colleagues who can reply and insert their own donation amount as well into that. So it's not really moving past philanthropy, but what it's doing is that it's like almost like a messaging app where every message has a donation amount written next to it, and it's all linked, and creating a new thread of messages involves buying that hyper sort of impact by the initiator.
Makes sense. So that means that your investigative reporting would only really be able to fund the elimination of negative externalities, right? Essentially. So
Right.
You wouldn't have investigative reporters, for example, investigating why I don't know. You said in the Maoist areas of central India, they've had these this really great project. You wouldn't really have an incentive for reporting on the great stuff, but you would have a potential incentive for reporting on the really detrimental stuff.
Yep. Yeah, funding positive externalities is still difficult, but you can actually eliminate negative externalities with this approach. Yeah.
Yeah, as long as there doesn't end up being seems that a risk is that people end up wanting, so investigative journalists, because they rely on the existence of negative externalities as their source of funding, it can end up kind of with the Trump effect in the United States, where CNN and others ended up being dependent on viewership coming from outrage about Trump as their income.
Right.
And so you can have kind of perverse incentives.
Yeah. Yeah, and like every story has to lead to a lawsuit, basically. I think that's
That's
the other
right.
flip side of it. Yeah. Which is also
Yeah.
not bad. Like, I mean, when I spoke about this to some journalists, they said, "Oh, we'd actually love that because that allows for discovery, where you can get all the documents from the party that they're investigating, which actually helps you write a better story as well, right?" So,
Mhm.
so I think
Yeah,
from that angle, a lot of
it's an interesting
yeah,
model.
yeah.
Are either of these active projects that you are um, sinking time into?
I mean, I just kind of I was attending a meetup in DC where I met someone who was also interested in similar ideas, and we brainstormed this together. So this was around 2 weeks ago, actually, like not very recent. And like kind of well, like we've also looked into the legal aspects of this, and there's an interesting regulation that Obama had issued called Regulation Crowdfunding, Regulation CF. Have you heard of it?
No.
So Regulation CF says that you can crowdfund up to $5 million and it's not construed as a security. It doesn't fall under the same laws. So basically what this means is that you can crowdfund $5 million for funding an investigative reporter and the legal team that would file a public interest litigation or a class action lawsuit based on the story. And as long as it's all under $5 million, you can actually issue it in the form of tokens and even repay the token holders from whatever award the judge gives you. So, so it's actually even doable on the legal front. I think that's what's exciting about it too.
Wow, that's amazing. Hmm.
Yeah, I'm kind of confused on the next steps, to be honest. Like, how to go about something like this. Yeah.
Yeah.
Would it be to contact the reporters? Would it be to kind of contact lawyers? I mean, there are a lot of kind of jigsaw puzzles and moving pieces.
So then, say impact report, so then you also are thinking a lot about mechanisms for allocating for impact for retroactive funding impact certification, right?
Hmm. Yep.
And you are what do you call it? A certifier or you have a term?
I mean, impact evaluator, I guess.
Yeah, impact evaluator. Um, how do you think about that? Like, are you following pretty closely what's happening with optimism, how Hypersearch is thinking about impact evaluation, etc.?
Yes, I'm very closely following that. I even met Carl recently in the New York trip, Carl
Oh,
Caravone,
nice.
and yeah, and like funding the commons was kind of the birthplace of Hypersearch. Kind of there was a 9 month sprint after the last funding the commons where they created it. So kind of excited as well about the upcoming conference over there, like in a week. So I
Mhm.
think yeah, like I'm working very and like what I'm particularly interested in, especially for the citizen journalism idea, is the idea of e-scriptions. You must be familiar with ordinals, right?
I'm not. No.
Oh, okay. So ordinals are so people are telling me that the excitement in the Bitcoin ecosystem is very similar to the excitement in Ethereum in 2017. And that's because of an innovation called ordinals, Ordinals.
Hmm.
Ordinals are basically a way of creating NFTs in Bitcoin. They use the metadata and the call data to kind of do it in a relatively cheap manner. So now there's like a ton of innovation going on in the Bitcoin ecosystem, like Bitcoin PFP projects, BRC20 tokens, like Bitcoin tokens, and like kind of, they're really leveraging a lot of the kind of like kind of the functionalities of Bitcoin, which is really the mother chain. It's the OG chain. Um, so I think like kind of what I've been looking into is if people can, when they're writing these messages, if we can inscribe it on a blockchain like Bitcoin or Ethereum, I feel like it might have some real value. Kind of, and it's very low gas fees. I think that's the best thing about ordinals or inscriptions, that it's really low gas. So I think I'm really looking at how we can have hypercerts, but also integrate it with something like inscriptions or ordinals.
But for me, the mechanism by which you encode these tokens is not as interesting as uh, the the challenge of how much should you retroactively fund.
Hmm.
So I do X project, I provide water to a community. Um, uh, how much should that community pay me at some point in the future for having provided this benefit?
Yeah, I think the answer I give to that every time is that it should be on a fixed cost plus percentage basis. So, like, kind of your cost of providing that service along with the raw materials was, say, $100, and you want to keep, like, say, a profit margin of 5%. So then then the community should pay you $105 basically.
Right. This though is called cost plus in government contracting, and it's used commonly as a payment, a way to structure agreements with, for example, utility providers. So you'll hire someone who's an expert utility management company,
Mhm.
and you'll pay them cost plus,
Right.
the cost of running it plus some percentage. The risk though is that what ends up happening is they have an incentive to increase their costs, because the bigger their costs are, the bigger that plus is, right?
Hmm.
And
Yep.
so it ends up it creates this net incentive for people to increase their costs over time.
Definitely. But I wonder if that would also be the case if there was a competitive market where if you increase your cost, someone else will just undercut you.
Right. So then this is there's contract bids for cost plus bidding of who gets the right to run the um, the utility. The problem then is that if you pick the lowest bidder, oftentimes they're woefully underprepared to actually do the job well.
Yep.
And so you end up with, let's say, for example, what's happening in the UK right now, where they have sewage that's leaking into their waterways, or that's intentionally flushed into their waterways because they have this like cost plus model.
Right. Right. I think like a pricing model, like say Uber, kind of works because it's a homogenized product, right? It just gets you from
Right.
point A to point B. But I guess you can't cleanly apply a system like that to social goods and public goods funding. Yeah.
Um, yeah. Yeah. There's a notion that like, what do you think is the right amount to be emitted to a project as a result of their impact? Is it, well, I guess you gave it an answer, which is cost plus. One of the answer given by optimism is that the profit that they earn should be the total impact that they had.
The profit that who earns, their optimism earns.
The profit that the public goods provider earns should be the total impact.
Right. Impact is equal to profit, right? Is their North Star.
That's what they say. Yeah.
Yeah.
What do you think of
Yeah, but
this?
I think like kind of the problem is that you might end up favoring impact with shorter timelines. That's like one issue that like kind of if an impact happens quickly and there's a certain window that might be prioritized, but some impact happens over decades and kind of actually measuring. I guess you could do that through regular rounds and regular evaluations. Um, yeah, I think it's an inherently subjective uh, like an inherently subjective science. Like depending on the mood you have when you woke up, you might calculate it in a certain way. And I think kind of there's a difference also between wanting to algorithmize that impact is equal to profit, which optimism has not done. Like I don't think they've been audacious enough to try algorithmizing that yet. They've kind of just made it like kind of dependent upon the will of the community and like through different badge holders voting for it. So I think yeah, I think we should distinguish between algorithmizing impact is equal to profit and between humans kind of deciding which has been valuable contributions to an ecosystem.
How would you think about algorithmizing that?
Yeah, that's a fun question. I think like I would actually prefer an LLM doing that, like an LLM rating the impact. So basically, you kind of encode like kind of the context which is common across different impacts, and then you ask the LLM to rate them on a scale of 0 to 10. That's actually an approach we tried because we have this database of 10,000 impact reports, which we're trying to convert into hypercerts from the media outlets, kind of the citizen journalism ones. And I
Yep.
gave some of these, and I wanted to get like some sort of evaluation score, some rating on them. So kind of I just fed them to GPT-4 and I asked them to rate the impacts on a scale of 1 to 10. And it was actually not bad. Like kind of there was one journalism report which said that a tree fell across the road. And then after they reported this on the platform, the tree got taken away. And that report got like a 6 on 10 compared to another story about like a teacher not coming to school. And it talked about how, and that got like an 8 on 10, like because the teacher started coming to school after it was reported. So then that got a higher rating because they said that's like a fundamental right. It has effects extending into the future, whereas the tree falling is an inconvenience more than a matter of like fundamental rights. So I think it was interesting that LLMs were able to differentiate between different types of impact and kind of reflect that in their scoring as well. So I really think that rather than having a human do impact is equal to profit, I think an LLM doing it is actually the better approach. Even though this is highly controversial, like I mean, like yeah, so I just think it's better, like because at least it's not dependent on the mood of the person, which person is doing it. It's just too much subjectivity if we had to have humans doing it.
I think that there is something there. Like I think that there's a generative role and then there's an elicive role. And this is how I think about intelligence in general, is that you want to come up with as many ideas as possible. And if you can, you kind of tile the entire parameter space, right? Every possible way that you could change things, you imagine what it would look like if it was that way. Most of the time, this is intractable, but like once you reach chess, this is intractable. With checkers, it's possible. But so you enumerate all possibilities at an inference depth of 1, and then you do an elisive step where you cut out those possibilities that are not actually interesting, right?
Right.
And so the generative process is very elisive, comes from the word elision, right? To omit. The generative process is extremely difficult for a human to do, whereas the elisive process is easy for us to do. And so I think that an LLM that does the generative process, as long as the output goes through an elisive step, then I think that I think it's safe.
Right.
It might influence our priors quite a bit, depending on what the LLM says. But you could also imagine many people's different LLMs doing this. You could imagine humans, a handful of humans doing this manually, and then comparing against the output of the LLM as a type of elision. But I agree with you that LLMs can play a role in evaluation.
Right. Yep. And I think I don't know if you read the impact evaluation paper that Protocol Labs put out, where they talked about the different impact evaluator systems there are. So one system is like a closed quantitative system, which is entirely algorithmic. Then in the middle, you have a human in the loop systems, where the entire process is algorithmized, but then a human being has to press a button that, okay, fine, this analysis makes sense or it doesn't make sense. And then on the last end, you have something like a peer review process, which is extremely human and labor intensive. So I think kind of what you're suggesting is that you let the AI do that full analysis, but then you have a human in the loop to actually kind of say, hey, does this even make sense? Is the AI very much off the mark over here? And kind of looking into some of those aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's right. I'm gonna have to read that that paper. Yeah, and I even think that the optimal system is one where you dynamically range between those 3 different modes. So there is a mode in a highly unexplored territory where it's pure peer review, right? It's just humans that are maybe they're using tools in addition to this, but most of the thought is being done by humans as they construct the evaluation framework. And then that evaluation framework is kind of encoded algorithmically, and it runs automatically. So now like all of their work is amortized across many, many, many different projects. And of course, people can disagree with the framework, and disagreeing with the framework automatically changes the structure. But that means that it's kicked back to peer review. And then and so you can see how like over time, if the algorithm outputs a number that a person disagrees with, then they just go and they disagree with it. And then that propagates back upward to peer review. And then that modifies the algorithmic structure. And then that becomes a new algorithm, which is then automatically applied. And what's cool about this is it's kind of like how, at least in the United States, the judicial and legislative systems work. Let's just consider the judicial system, which is that you have cases, and the cases are either handled by case law, which is kind of like the algorithm, at the edges. But if the case law is insufficient to handle that case, then it gets kicked up to a higher level. And at the higher level, they're able to consider more parameters that could be tweaked. And by tweaking these parameters, it changes the algorithm, right?
Yeah, right. Wow, I did not see the analogy actually between that, but you're completely right over it.
But then the issue that this runs into is that ultimately you bottom out at peer review, and the question is, how should those peers be chosen? Because the United States right now, at least, is suffering from because the Supreme Court is so important. And sorry that this is so United States centric. It's like the analogy that I'm familiar with. the Supreme Court is so important now politically that the mechanisms by which you get to put judges in place are being politically fought over. And so, of course, in the limit, people are going to want to control who those judges are. And so,
I mean,
ideally, you would have.
isn't that what optimism has done though? Like the badge holders are the peer review and the Supreme Court judges, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And so how do they get there, and do they deserve to be there, and how would you challenge it? Only other badge holders can challenge it. And if you allowed a voting system, then you would end up with other problems, right? So judge select, this is called the problem of judge selection, and it is very hard.
Right. Yep. India has kind of one of the most independent systems for judges because judges choose other judges in Indian system.
Interesting.
India and Israel were the only two countries to have this. And I think Israel wanted to change it, and that caused a lot of protests and whatnot. So I think India might be the only country to have this system now.
Israel wanted to switch to the Indian system?
No. Israel had the Indian system, and then the government wanted more say in who the judges are and kind of appointing the judges. And that kind of caused a lot of protest. And I don't know what the latest status is. In India as well, like kind of the government passed a law saying that they can have a committee where 3 members are government, 3 members are judges. But then the judges ruled it as unconstitutional and threw it out. So the
That is
judges said that
hilarious.
and like the funniest part is that the Supreme Court, the Chief Justice of India's Supreme Court, has to retire at 62 years old. It's mandatory, but he's also untouchable because like there was one case where the Chief Justice had allegations of like harassing women and all of that against him. But in order to impeach the Chief Justice, you have to get permission of the Chief Justice. To impeach any judge. Yeah, to impeach any judge, you need the permission of the Chief Justice of India. But then if it's the Chief Justice himself, he's not going to give permission and you can't do anything about it.
Yeah.
And I think it's funny, sometimes you need that one guy who's untouchable, in the system.
I don't think so. I think how do you think of solving this judge selection problem?
I wonder if Gitcoin's approach is a good one.
What's the Gitcoin
Where you
approach?
let kind of the wisdom of the crowds. Yeah, like you let them of the crowds build kind of what is worthwhile and what is good and what isn't.
Uh-oh. Did you move because your connection
So
just
what
dropped?
I've seen with Gitcoin is that it works atrociously with small numbers because you can hear me now. Hello.
Try again. Hello.
Yeah, you can hear me.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yep. Yeah. So I was just saying that Gitcoin basically lets the wisdom of the crowds decide which project is worthwhile and is worthy of funding, and it works very well with large numbers. Like the open source round, it made complete sense, which projects got the most money and which got the least. But when we looked at the climate round and the Web3 community round, the numbers were all off because basically there were very few voters. And because of that, kind of the project that managed to bribe 100 people to vote for them, and it ended up getting a large chunk of the pie. Yeah. So I think kind of if you have sufficient participation. Yeah.
I don't know. I don't think that I don't think it's about participation. I think that quadratic voting is fundamentally susceptible to bribery and collusion. And I don't think you're going to solve the bribery problem. I think it's impossible to solve the bribery problem. So I don't have hope for quadratic voting as a mechanism, especially not quadratic funding because of how profitable it is to bribe.
But I do feel like it worked for the open source round because you had like 6,000 votes and 8,000 votes and like really high numbers of votes. So to actually bribe those many people manually in a 2 week period is actually not easy, if you think about it. I mean, yeah, you
I
can
think
bribe 100 people, 200 people in 2 weeks, but like if each project is getting like 6,000 votes, 8,000 votes, how much does that matter, right?
so I wrote an article about this. I can share it with you. It's called Bribery, I think. And
Hmm.
the problem of it's all about the bribery problem. Um, let me see if I can pull up this. I don't think it's a very well written article, but it covers this, and it covers it specifically in relation to. Oh yeah, I have to open great work. It covers it specifically in relation to um, quadratic funding, and the 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 problem is that you can, thanks to crypto, you can easily set up ways to fund people to automate bribery, right? So if I have an account
Hmm.
on Gitcoin, you could imagine set up a smart contract, which makes it really easy to for me to opt into being bribed.
Hmm.
Kind of like
Hmm.
the Fiverr.com for bribery.
Yeah, right.
There are some ideas on how to make this harder. Um, I think I mentioned them in the article, but it's not super straightforward. So in my approach is I just accept the bribery problem as something
Hmm.
you're not going to get around, and instead fall back to dynamic forking and merging. So allow communities to, if they have a um, if they have a judge, a set of judges that don't represent them, allow them to easily and dynamically partially fork away from the governance of those judges. And then if those judges like start to represent them more, or they represent them in a certain dimension, allow them to merge partially and dynamically back to the whole. And so this would be the mechanism to enable
Isn't
that.
that similar to kind of delegates? That if really trust someone who's a good Gitcoin delegate, I'll delegate my Gitcoin to him or her. And then if they kind of perform badly, make a wrong decision, I can withdraw my stake, which I've given them, right?
Yes. So the problem with delegates is the problem with any representative, which is that the representative can earn their position as a function of populism. Um,
Mm,
and so you end up with someone who gets in their place because they're a classic demagogue, right? They're really good at, they're highly charismatic, but they're not actually competent. And so the way that the hope that I have here is that you can allow, there's like a staking mechanism where these delegates can stake against what they claim is going to happen. It's kind of like a prediction market. And
mm,
then everybody who also delegates to them ends up being a partial owner of that stake. And so if it
mm.
doesn't turn out, then they lose a whole bunch of money. And
Nice.
so that gives them a reason to carefully select the people that they delegate to, so that there isn't the principal agent problem.
Right. Yep. So it's like futarchy in some way, I guess. Futarchy.
Yeah, it's a spin on futarchy. I talked to Robin Hanson about futarchy. I have reservations. Um, um, in particular, I just think that markets take their own information as input. So markets, I think, are highly manipulable. Um,
Mm,
uh, and so that's my primary concern with futarchy. And so what I've tried to do is change how markets behave. I've created a different kind of primitive, which is not a market, but has market-like properties that is more difficult to manipulate.
mm,
And basically, the reason that it's more difficult to manipulate is because you get downside, but you don't get upside.
yeah.
So you don't have speculative, speculative self-reference.
So how does hypersearch play into everything that you're working on and building and thinking about?
Um, Hypersearch is going to, I'm still talking to Carl about it. But Hypersearch is on the right track, I feel like. There's definitely you definitely want the ability to mint new currencies that are what's it called when that are non-counterfeitable? They can't be counterfeited. And Hypersearch would enable that. I mean, any NFT would enable that, but I think Hypersearch fits in like a nice cognitive category. And then Hypersearch is also working on how to do impact evaluation. And so I'm hanging out with them, trying to work on that with them as well.
Yep.
How about for you?
I think like more as um a like a unit of impact, like kind of if we like the idea and I really like the idea of what you said about a cognitive category, which is what hypersearch is, because kind of NFTs have taken up that space of like making outsized returns, and if the project succeeds, then you will make like 100 or 1,000x return, whereas I think hypersearch don't suffer from that same baggage and background, because I think
That's
that's
right.
the real split up in the public goods community, that do we create impact NFTs or do we create hypersearch? And I think these are two very different paths that kind of we can take as a community. So I'm personally on the hypersearch part because it doesn't have that same baggage and expectations that NFTs do.
That's right. I agree. Branding matters. As much as I'd prefer that all that matters are mechanisms, brands matter. Yeah.
No, and even like at a technical level, hypercerts are 1155, whereas NFTs are 721, and that also has a kind of whole range of implications. Because kind of what my co-founder is working on is creating some sort of game or metaverse which uses hypercerts to mint tokens and to kind of create in-game utilities and buying land and whatnot. So I think that's
Oh, it's
another
cool.
way that you can get buy pressure here, that like people buy impact in order to buy land in the metaverse. So
That is really cool.
that's yeah,
Hey,
it will be
so
really sick. Yeah.
um, I invited a recorder to this meeting. Would you mind
Yep.
if I then share the recording back to you? And
Yeah, definitely.
honestly, I think that this has been a great conversation. I wonder if you'd feel comfortable um, publishing something like this. Is there anything you said that feels like wouldn't be something that you want to publish?
No, nothing at all. No.
Okay.
Yeah.
Then I'll upload this as a conversation to YouTube, and then first I'll give you a chance to review, and then I'll just upload it as a conversation, because I think that these are the
Yeah.
sorts of conversations that can allow all of us to start to orient around one another.
Yep. Definitely.
Amazing. Well, I have another call I need to jump to. This has been such a pleasure to get to hang
Yeah,
out
it's
with you
really
finally.
been good fun. Yep. Definitely.
Extreme fun. All right.
Yeah.
Thank you. And
See
I'll
you.
turn my video on to Wave. Take care.
Yeah. Okay. See you there.
Bye.
Okay.